For the audiophiles, myself included, who are sick and tired of $3 worth of crossover components stuffed inside an unbraced box with the structural integrity of a dirty diaper, which is then sent down an assembly line in China for 3,000 coats of high-gloss nonsense, have I got some good news for you. AudioCraftsman is a Canadian loudspeaker company that is laser-line focused on offering premium hand-built speakers, and would you know it, ditches the concept of cheap and cheesy parts altogether. Even more, they take bracing seriously, and for the love of all things holy, actually uses high-quality Sayaz drivers in both of the models that we are looking at today. So yeah, today's video is indeed refreshing, and I'll be letting the cat out of the bag now. Both of these speakers measure well, both of them sound good, and one of them actually sounds excellent. So yeah, without wasting another second, let's check out the AudioCraftsman Laval and Victoria and see what these things have to offer. Standing 15 inches high, 8 inches wide, and 12 inches deep, the Laval is AudioCraftsman entry-level offering priced just under $2,000 for the pair. With a frequency range of 38 Hz to 25 kHz and a 90 decibel sensitivity rating, the Lavals could be a one-stop solution for many audiophiles using them in a small or medium-sized room. In the sound shed, which is 28 feet deep, 18 feet wide, and 11 feet high, I had no trouble getting bass down to 40 Hz. And this was with the speakers placed 8 feet into the listening room, which is a lot to ask for any kind of a speaker, let alone a bookshelf-style speaker. So, unless you need to hit the very bottom octave, you won't have to worry about adding subs with Lavals. And while there's nothing wrong with adding subs, it's impressive to see such high bandwidth performance from a stand-mounted speaker. The Laval's driver complement uses Sayaz Prestige series featuring an aluminum and magnesium dome tweeter on top and a woven polycone woofer down below. As for their sonic attributes, well, you already know I'm not a big fan of aluminum, and I doubt that's going to change anytime soon. In a perfect world, also known as Ronlandia, I would have preferred a soft dome in the Laval. Likewise, while the polycone woofer sounds pretty nice, it would have been pure sunshine and rainbows if it were a paper cone offering. But, and yes, this is a good but, even with an aluminum tweeter and poly woofer, I liked what I heard from Laval, and I think that a lot of folks out there will dig them as well. Of course, more on that in the listening impressions. Standing 16 inches high, 9 inches wide, and 14 inches deep, Victoria is AudioCraftsman premium two-way stand mount that is priced at $4K for the pair. With a frequency response of 42 Hz to 25K and 88 decibel rating, Victoria doesn't hit quite as low as her younger sibling, but to my ears, sounds more textured and more refined than Laval. In the shed, I was still able to hit mid-40s, which is nothing to laugh at, and at the same time, Victoria sounded more focused in the low end, trading the ability to dig slightly deeper in exchange for higher resolution in bass texture. Also, while not being able to reach as low as Laval, I noticed when listening and shooting in-room measurements that it was Victoria who played bass with more confidence than Laval in much more critical areas where a lot more music content is playing, let's say from 50 Hz to 80 Hz. The driver complement of the speakers makes use of Sayaz Excel series with a soft dome tweeter on top and, drum roll please, paper cone woofer on the bottom. And as you have already guessed, I was pleased to see the materials being used in Victoria, and while she is more expensive than Laval, I think the difference heard between the two justifies the difference in price. Last, as I mentioned from the start, AudioCraftsman has abandoned the idea of using networks in their speakers that are cheaper than the ones used to control the windshield wipers in your car. That's right, folks. In case of Laval and Victoria, no sandcast resistors, no electrolytic caps, and nothing else that would lead me to believe that these speakers are going to make their way to an upgrade video from you-know-who down the road.
Hey everybody.
Sure, there are some choices in voicing that AudioCraftsman went with that could be called into question, and by all means, the soul and capacitors being used might not suit every single hi-fi purist out there, but here is my point. The parts we are seeing in these speakers are much, much, much better than what we typically see from corporate hi-fi, even at these price points. Piggybacking on my recent teaser videos of checking out some of these cheap Chinese amplifiers, I made it clear that soundstage is the #1 goal for this audiophile cowboy. I also hinted at the idea that even an amplifier, yes, the thing that wakes up your speakers and makes them dance, can have an impact on the stage. While I won't be doing a deep dive into that subject today, say hello to my little friend, also known as a Dynaco ST70, an audiophile classic and one of the most popular tube amplifiers in hi-fi history. But, would you know it, this thing ain't your grandpa's ST70, no sir-ree. This bad boy has been tweaked with auto bias features and a complete overhaul of the Dynaco's audio path. And don't you worry folks, I'll be spending some time talking about this amp in detail soon enough, but for now, here is what you need to know. This amp can take any speaker that has good bones or has the ability to spread their wings, and with the flick of a switch, the soundstage is unlocked. Now, while I did try a multitude of amplifiers with Laval and Victoria, this Dynaco, along with the Galleon TS120, was my favorite pairing. Yes, you could go solid state, but when we get to the measurements and chat a little bit about the voicing of both of these speakers, it will make a little bit more sense as to why I reached for tubes. And as far as my other gear, I was using my ENEOS Zenith, which was feeding the goods to my Dodd Audio DAC outfitted with the wonderful Sparkos Labs SS3602 op amps, which was running into my Dodd Audio 2 preamplifier, and all of this combined, well folks, we had some freaking magic to work with. Both of these speakers measure a lot alike, but they sound much different from each other than one might expect just by looking at a frequency response. Indeed, there are some subtle and nuanced differences while listening, and I think despite the similarities seen in their voicing, it's the materials of the drivers, cabinet construction, and bracing that is really setting these two speakers apart from each other. When it comes to top-end extension, Laval sounds like a speaker that does no wrong. AudioCraftsman did a good job of hiding most of the bad attributes of a poorly voiced aluminum tweeter, and I didn't hear anything that I would call wrong or offensive at all. All too often, aluminum drivers can be the equivalent of your buddy coming over for Super Bowl Sunday and cranking the saturation of your TV to make the green grass look like green grass on crack. Well, I won't spend a lot of time on this because it's not what Laval sounds like. It just seems to me that aluminum drivers rarely ever sound right and almost always sound enhanced, forward, or metallic. So yeah, with Laval, while not the most expressive or clean top end that I have ever heard, it just sounded fine and it really did no wrong. Cymbal hits never sounded forward, and most of the decay that I am listening for was indeed accounted for. I did, however, notice that when I was doing some side-by-side comparisons, that Laval's imaging and center focus couldn't quite keep up with Victoria, and for me, hearing micro details like lip sounds, spatial cues, and the top end of acoustics was much easier to pick up with Victoria. Speaking of, Victoria seems to offer a more natural and neutral top end, and to me, just sounds right when it comes to decay rolling off the tips of cymbal hits. Pressing play on my reference playlist on Qobuz, I was impressed with the decay structure that I heard in the speaker, and it reminded me of what I hear in my own reference encores. Also, even more than just tone or just how the instrument sounded, it was the placement of decay that really caught my attention with Victoria. Firing up the missing piece by Peter F. Eglis, I was hearing decay from anything percussive on this track all in its right place. Whether it's the top end of a snap or a crack from a percussive instrument, or the delicate resonance heard from chimes, I noticed that the placement of everything heard with Victoria simply sounds right and very detailed. So yeah, both speakers measure similar on top, but certainly don't sound the same. While the overall tone might be close, there is something more airy and expressive with Victoria. All in all, the top end Laval is good, but the top end of Victoria is very good, if not excellent. When it comes to mid-range and covering all things vocals, Laval sounded just a tad heavier in male vocals and less detailed with female vocals. Later in the measurements, we can see why male vocals have a little bit more meat on the bones, but when it comes to a little less detail in female vocals, it really was difficult to quantify. This goes to show, folks, parts matter, and they matter a lot. And while that certainly does cover crossover parts, it also includes the drivers being used in our speakers. And for me, which I have heard more times than I can count, a quality soft dome tweeter in the right network will always deliver the details better than an aluminum cone tweeter, and this is no exception with these speakers. Now, without backpedaling, I really had no issues with the mid-range performance in Laval, and like I had mentioned about its top-end performance, it was fine and really well behaved, meaning while I wish that vocals offered a little bit more transparency and clarity, they never sounded shouty, too forward, bright, or anything that would have led this review in a different direction. If you guys remember my review of the Triangle 40th Anniversary Comets, which again are $2,500, loaded with a bunch of really cheap parts, that's the kind of direction this could have gone if things didn't sound right. But back on point, when it comes to mid-range, all things considered, Lavals do a pretty good job, and many folks would appreciate how they sound, even though I was looking for a little bit more detail in this particular bandwidth. As for Victoria trying something like Eva Cassidy's take of Fields of Gold, it is very clear exactly where she is in the stage, exactly where the acoustic guitar is, and even more, micro details that one would want being conveyed from that track is accounted for the second that you press play and Victoria starts to sing. Going back and forth between Laval and Victoria, it became clear time and time again that the center image and details in the stage were easier to track with Victoria and quickly dismantled the question, so why is this one more expensive than the other? For me, the differences aren't so subtle, and I would expect that you guys will easily be able to hear this in the sound clips. Either way, Victoria's mid-range covers more ground and turns over more stones that makes it easier to relive those early audiophile moments of hearing something new in a song that you never noticed before. Male vocals sound clean and precise, and I don't notice any kind of bloom or added resonance in the voicing as well. The additional bracing in Victoria really shines here, and while the speaker is a backbreaker in weight, it is all of this mass that really helps with cleaning up the mid-range and letting it shine without any kind of box coloration. Female vocals, as I've already mentioned, are beautiful and very detailed. They are easy to track and maintain perfect imaging track after track. From a bandwidth standpoint, Laval does dig deeper on paper, and for folks who simply want deep bass from a stand mount, and that is a massive priority for them, then the cheaper Laval might be a bit more tempting between the two. Also, as for things that we can't, or I should say I can't measure, the materials being used in woofers, also impart their own flavors of texture and tone. As for Laval, the speakers sound heavier and a bit more dense in the lower frequencies, whereas Victoria sounds lighter, quicker, and more detailed in the lower part of the bandwidth. All this to say, the Laval's lower part of the voicing might win over folks who simply want a more robust, deeper, and thicker sounding bass response. As for Victoria, call me crazy or call me right, but she just has more detailed texture in the lower half of her voicing. Trading deep, heavy-handed bombs for quicker and more articulate jabs is what this speaker is all about, and between the two speakers, I preferred what I heard in Victoria when it comes to bass. For me, deep bass from a stand mount, or any speaker for that matter, just doesn't get me all that excited anymore. I have 4 subs running in the shed, with 2 open baffle direct servo subs in the front, and 2 sealed subwoofers just to my right and left of the sweet spot. With this, I'd much rather hear a speaker focused on articulation and bass harmonics rather than just playing low, deep bass, and that for me is where Victoria pulled into the lead ahead of Laval. For folks who want to dive into the complete picture of what an upright bass actually sounds like, I would imagine that they would agree with me that this is where Victoria starts to flex some musical muscles over the more affordable Laval. Since we already have a winning formula for soundstage with all of the gear that we are feeding these speakers, they really had no excuse not to let go and completely disappear. The good news is, in both cases, this is exactly what happened, and both do bring the goods when it comes to delivering that spooky 3D-like performance. It took time to figure out some of the key differences here, and when I did, it was easier to pick up as the review process continued. The Laval sounds deep and wide, and nothing ever sounds really forward. Again, hats off to AudioCraftsman for wrestling this aluminum tweeter into submission, because that's not an easy thing to do. Layering and separation was also good, and I had no issues with identifying instruments within the stage regardless of their placement. Now, swapping out Laval for Victoria, taking everything that I just said, add another foot or 2 of reach, and you are picking up what I'm putting down. Surely, Victoria sounds wider and deeper than Laval, and it was the width that really stood out the most. Even on simple recordings like Dominique Fils-Aimé's rendition of Stand By Me, where it was the sound of the room that reached all the way to my back far left and far right shoulder. Going back to Laval, the effect was close, but didn't quite compete with how immersive Victoria was capable of playing. All right, folks, in today's sound clips, we are going to put these two up against each other and compare them back to back. All the clips are recorded using my Earthworks QTC40s and Zoom F8N, and while these clips can be played back on anything, I do recommend headphones for the best playback experience, and with that, let's go.
Engineer, where are you headed? Engineer, where are you headed?
No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar, jamás no quería saber nada más, nunca más. No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar, jamás no quería saber nada más, nunca más.
So, What did you hear in the clips? Do they match my listening impressions, or did you hear something totally different? Please feel free to share your comments and thoughts down below, and with that, let's finish this review by checking out the measurements. All right, on top we have the on axis of Laval, and on the bottom we can compare this to the response to Victoria. As I've already mentioned, both responses actually look a lot alike, and taking a look at them overlaid on top of each other, you can see there are a lot of similarities here. As I've mentioned, I decided to reach for tubes in this review because both of these speakers do offer a slight elevation around the critical region of 2K. So that's a voicing decision, and not everybody is going to love that. And while the rise in the response never stood out as being bright in my listening, I just felt like having some tubes to help smooth things out was a better choice with these speakers, and after going back and forth, I did prefer that sound over solid state. Also, from 200 to 500 hertz, Laval does show a slight lift in response, which could be one reason why vocals sounded a little bit heavier or offered more meat on the bones, combined with the fact that we have a different material being used for the driver, poly, which I think just sounds a bit heavier to me. Anyways, from 3K and beyond, both speakers show similar traits, and while there are some minor deviations, I think this is a great example how two speakers can measure a lot alike and yet sound different. Waterfalls on both of these speakers look very clean, and even when switching to the top-down view, I didn't see anything that would have concerned me with stored energy from either speaker. All right, pulling up the horizontal response on both speakers, they look great. There are no issues here, and both of them offer an even fall away on the horizontal plane. The vertical response on both speakers also looks pretty good, and while not the best that we have seen on this channel, there is nothing here that concerns me. There is, as you guys can see, a slight sag around the crossover points, which could indicate a slight phase issue as the microphone is moving up, but all in all, this ain't bad. Certainly nothing to freak out about, and for the most part, everything here looks really good. Folks, I think it's high time that we have companies like AudioCraftsman that are offering us what we really want. This is what audiophiles really, honestly want. We don't want just a pretty, glossy speaker with just a bunch of junk on the inside and drivers with a ton of issues that require a lot more junky parts thrown on the network to correct those issues. We don't want that. We want a company that actually cares, that is using high quality parts, that is practicing literally fundamental, like speaker 101 building techniques with great bracing, beautiful looking speakers. These don't look like junk. They're not made in a freaking garage. Like, they're doing a good job from beginning to end. And it's companies like this that I think we really need to be paying attention to because they're getting it right. And so both of these speakers, absolutely recommended. Laval is good. It's good. Victoria is great. And with that, I will see you audio craftsman loving audiophiles in the next video.